First of all, before we begin, I know we have a couple of guests in here today, and I welcome you. I'm glad that you're here and that you chose to come. I will tell you, we don't usually read weird verses like this one. That usually we're a little bit more into, the stories of Jesus or the New Testament or the Old Testament, the parts that we pay attention to. But this summer, we are spending some time talking about the Bible stories, and in this case, the Bible verse that the preacher never told you. And so we're going to talk about that today. This is the last Sunday of this series, and it has been fun again this summer as it was last, at least for me. I know that I learned something, and I hope that you did as well. And I'm sure that you all will be happy to get back to something a little bit more familiar, though, next weekend and the weeks ahead. And we'll have to see if we revisit this again next summer. I'm running out of stories at this point, so we may have to do something different next summer. But we'll have to see what happens with that. Well, for today, we have not so much a story as we have a commandment. And I knew at the beginning of the summer that I wanted to finish with something like this because this one verse is really kind of a symbol of so much of this part of the Bible. Go ahead and take your Bibles out of the pews in front of you and just turn through the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We like the stories of Moses that are in here. That's good. That's good text for a Charlton Heston movie. We like the Genesis stories, but there is a lot in these first 5 books of the Bible. Maybe you've heard of them called the Pentateuch or the Torah. There is a lot in here that we don't turn to very often because it seems very different, very kind of foreign to us in our lives today. And part of that is because we as Christians have set some parts of this part of the Bible aside and said that it's not really part of our tradition anymore. For example, if you were to read the command in Deuteronomy 22, verses 6 and 7, that if you were taking a walk this afternoon and happen across a bird's nest with eggs in it, that you may take the eggs from the nest for your culinary delight, but let the mother go, taking only the young for yourself, in order that it may go well with you and you may live long. That's in the text. I know that some of you have been eating eggs out of nests all your lives and then finishing the mother bird off too, just because you were hungry and you didn't even know that you were doing something wrong, did you? Or take the command in Leviticus 19:19, which warns against wearing garments made of 2 different materials. If any of you slime balls had the audacity to show up today wearing a cotton blend, I am here to tell you to change your ways and shape up. And there are lots of other commandments that are along that same theme. Many of which we as Christians, like I said, have set aside for good theological reasons. But what is the point of them? That's what I want to explore today. And to do so, I'm going to talk about this one verse which Eric just shared with us because it illustrates a great deal about the old Hebrew law that even if we don't follow it to the letter anymore, it can tell us a lot about how to make our faith richer. So in that spirit, here is the last of the Bible stories seldom animated on our digital flannel graph. This depiction of this verse in the Bible. And so let's show that video now. This is the last of our Bible verses seldom animated.
Ye shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger that is in thy gates, that he may eat it, or thou mayest sell it unto an alien. For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk. Deuteronomy 14:21.
Okay, well that didn't flow quite the way that I expected it to. I think we had a little bit of a computer problem there, but I think you get the point about this verse. So of all the rules, of all the books of the Bible, why this one? I mean, you got dressed this morning. There is a fly here that's not appreciate it. He's about to be an object lesson in this story. Of all the stories, you got up today, decided to go to church, could have slept in, and you show up, and why am I talking about this of all things? How is this relevant? Why have I made you do this? I mean, truly, if only there were some way that this commandment not to eat things that have already died were relevant to my Texas congregation. If only there was a way that I, your humble New Mexican pastor, someone, an outsider, a foreigner, so to speak, if only there were a way to illustrate this. Except that there is. Because in the national news this year was the candidacy of Tink Nathan, who is running for Texas's 53rd State House District. And Tink ran on a very simple platform of repealing the laws and health regulations that outlaw taking roadkill off of the roads for human consumption. And don't worry, Tink didn't win his primary. He only got 151 votes. But what that means is that there were 151 people in the 53rd District, which is south of San Antonio, who were sitting back and saying to themselves, our people over here who've lived in San Antonio, apparently you know about this, there were 151 people who were saying, yeah, why is the government telling me I can't pull an armadillo off the road and cook him for dinner at night? That's fascist. I mean that in good fun. And if you don't appreciate it, if I make just a little bit of fun of Texas, then just spend 5 minutes in New Mexico, and you'll see something that you can make fun of me for, because we're weird in our own special ways. But something like this actually, something along the lines of this verse in this story actually happened to me. Well, kind of, or at least as close as I want to get. Has anyone ever been to Ozona, Texas? One person, okay? It's a couple of you. If you raised your hands, you have my condolences, because I've been to Ozona too. And I survived it, although it was a close call, because it was on a family vacation in high school on our way to San Antonio and to the beautiful beaches of South Padre Island, that we stopped in Ozona for lunch at Ozona's finest barbecue joint / taxidermy shop. And whatever you are imagining when you think of a barbecue diner / taxidermy shop, to understand the reality of what it actually was, just take a moment, whatever your mental picture is, just magnify it a little bit, because it was pretty wild. There were weird smells. As I ate my pork ribs, there was seriously the stuffed head of a boar right here, and they had used some kind of a resin to make drool hang down from the pig's lip, from the boar's lip. As you ordered, you could hear electric bone saws or other kinds of tools in the background. It was wild. But you know what's great about that place? We ate there 15 years ago. And when my family gets together, we still talk about that place every now and then. I don't know many meals that we had 15 years ago, other than that one, where we still talk about it. And I don't tell this story just to get a cheap laugh. I tell it because it illustrates sort of the same spirit or the same point as this first commandment in the verse, odd as that may sound. You shall not eat anything that dies of itself. Well, maybe that does sound a little bit odd. We would never think to do that. But that is sort of the problem, isn't it? That we don't think much about the reality of our food. We are disconnected, for the most part, from what we eat, unless you're a farmer, or unless you're Glenn Bearden and you work in the food industry. Food is something we get at the store. It's one more item for our consumption. It's not something that's harvested. It's not something that's slaughtered. We don't think about the sacrifice that goes into food anymore. Milk is no longer something that we see coming from a cow or some other kind of mammal. It's something that we get homogenized and separated and basically completely sterile. And all we really notice about it anymore is when it goes up by a few cents at the grocery store. But if you head on down to Taxidermy Barbecue, trust me, food becomes something real and something close. You get an appreciation for it. See, here's the thing. The Old Testament is full of these kinds of dietary laws, and we don't follow most of them anymore. But even if we don't follow them, we shouldn't lose our sense of the realities that go with food. Many Jewish people still follow the dietary laws today. Some foods are forbidden, like fish that don't have shells, or fish that don't have fins or scales, or meat from cloven-hoofed animals or creepy-crawly animals, which is to say that they're not allowed to eat lobster bisque or chocolate-covered ants or alligator gumbo, no Virginia ham or no breakfast sausage. Other foods have rules too, though. Meats must be slaughtered in a way that's quick and painless for the animal. And even if we don't follow all of these rules as Christians, they still should illustrate for us something that's true. Specifically, they tell us that we should pay attention. God cares about our dietary choices. And this should come as no surprise considering what happens in Genesis. What happens that constitutes the very first sin? Adam and Eve eat something that God tells them not to. The everyday aspects of our lives, how we use our money, how we speak and interact with people, how we view, use, and understand the nature of our bodies, what we eat, matters to God. In 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God?" We as Christians, we have to be careful that we do not buy into the age-old lie that there is a clear delineation between our souls and the spiritual on the one hand, and our bodies and the physical on the other. They both matter and they're both related to one another. In fact, the Judeo-Christian worldview, in that worldview, one can teach us about the other. Why is there a rule about not eating something that's died of its own accord? Well, there are some obvious practical reasons for that. The animal could have a disease. Something that dies of old age is probably not very good to eat anyways. But beyond that, in our everyday existence, what we eat gives us life. And if we eat something that has died in due course instead of being specifically slaughtered, if we're eating what we just happen across that's dead, then it mixes up our understanding of life and death. Maybe this rule sounds bizarre to us because most of us probably wouldn't do this anyways unless we live in Texas's 53rd district. It certainly sounds odd to me. But the problem it addresses is a very real part of our lives today. And all you have to do is go back to those grocery stores to see how. Which I love going to the grocery store. I'm a food guy. My family makes fun of me because if we're all together and we go to lunch, as we're walking out of the restaurant, I want to go to the grocery store so we can figure out what we're going to have for dinner that night. I like food. And this is a great system we have here in this country for our food. But it also insulates us from the reality of food. That food doesn't just appear. That food isn't something that we can just take for granted. And it isn't something we should waste. Here's a startling fact. You know how much food we waste in this country? 40% of what we produce. 40%. That's almost half. Which is to say that enough food to adequately nourish every impoverished person everywhere is thrown out. Or it sits on a store shelf till it hits the expiration date. That means that there's tons and tons of produce that's never purchased because consumers won't buy things because of little things like bruises. That's landfills full of uneaten leftovers. I know that's a lot to tie to one little rule about not eating dead stuff, but suffice to say that God calls us to pay attention to our food and how we use it. Okay. Then the verse goes on. You shall not eat anything that dies of itself, but you may give it to the immigrants residing in your towns for them to eat. Okay. Before we start to think that there is a solution to the border crisis through roadkill, what is being said here? See, like I said, the Israelites had all manner of rules about what was okay to eat and what wasn't. But there was recognition that among the people of Israel there were foreigners who didn't follow these rules. They weren't their customs. And so what this law is basically saying is it is okay to make allowance for different people around you. It is not fair to make them follow your customs. What this law is saying is we have to make room for one another. Some people have rules against eating some kinds of food. Other people don't. Make room for one another. I know this is a very peculiar part of the Bible, and we hardly ever turn to it. But this, I think, is the main fundamental issue of our time: our inability to make room for one another. If we're liberals, we can't make room for conservatives. If we're conservatives, we can't make room for liberals. If we're Israelis, we can't make room for Palestinians. If we're Palestinians, we won't make room for Israelis. If we're Christians in America, we will protest the mosque being built down the street. And if we're Muslims in Iraq, we'll do much worse than that, and we'll spray paint death threats on the homes of a tiny, insignificant Christian minority. We can't make room for each other. And if we can't figure out how to live the spirit of this command, if we can't figure out how to make room for one another, the violence and anger that we already see in our world is only going to continue to rage out of control. Which brings me to the last portion of the commandment: that you shall not boil a young animal in its mother's milk, which does sound kind of sadistic. It's not exactly clear why this commandment was inserted here, but there are a few clues. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel observed that boiling a baby in the milk of its mother mocks the reproductive order itself. It takes something that points towards new life in the form of milk and mixes itself with something that points towards death in the form of meat. And this is one rule that I'm particularly grateful that we don't follow anymore, because that means no cheeseburgers, and I love me a good cheeseburger. It sounds pretty arbitrary. But even if we don't follow the exact rule, once again, I would encourage all of us to still appreciate the spirit that is part of it. Because in the appreciation of life and death, food and nourishment, and all the work and sacrifice that goes into our nourishment, we recognize that God created our world with extraordinary provision for us. God created the world with a system in place that provides us what we need with our food. And we should be thankful to God and have respect for what He created. Lauren Winter tells us about an old book called The Supper of the Lamb. It's written by an Episcopal priest named Father Richard Capon. And this book is a little bit of a cookbook, and it's also a little bit of theology all along the way. Part of one recipe includes the absurd instruction to spend 1 hour chopping an onion. And it includes instructions to begin by spending time examining the onion, its shape, its skin, the texture, and the imperfections. What is Capon's point? Well, presumably not that we should spend 60 minutes every time we want to saute a Vidalia. Rather, he is making a case for paying attention. After an hour with your onion, you might begin to see that the uniqueness of creation is the result of continuous creative support from a God who pays loving attention to detail. God likes onions. Therefore, they exist. The fit, the feel, the color, the smells, they're not just part of some forgotten decree that there may as well be onions as there are turnips. They exist because they're good. Food is part of God's creation, and a right relationship with food points us toward God. I'm not going to sweat it too much the next time I bite into a cheeseburger. But we'll all do well to notice how something as simple and basic to our lives as food is something that God had in mind from the very beginning. Key limes, collard greens, oysters, venison, Bing cherries, and a million other foods, all of them point toward a God of extraordinary thought and provision. We even see this most clearly in our sacraments, in a glass of wine, in a loaf of bread. In John chapter 12, verse 24, Jesus tells us that unless a grain of wheat dies, it remains just a grain. But if it's planted in the ground, if it dies to itself, it will bear fruit that's much greater. And that fruit and those grains become bread. He's talking about more than a loaf of King's Hawaiian bread. Jesus is talking about a mystery where he dies, and through that death, he brings extraordinary life, abundant life. That's the meeting place of food and us and God. Most distinctly here at the table of the Lord. It's a table where we not only become present to God, but where God becomes present to us.